Thank you to Key Ministry for all the work you're doing to create communities of inclusion and belonging in churches all across the country. Communities where believing and belonging abound, where we just widen our welcome and invite just widely and wildly in so many different ways. So it's a joy to be with all of you and among so many people who are calling and equipping churches to be accessible and inviting communities for people with disabilities and their families. Communities that embrace people, certainly, but communities that are also enriched by their presence and that actually ache because of their absence. I've been praying a lot about this conference, that it would be a time of great encouragement and guidance for each of you, a time where we might really flourish together in this shared work of trying to change the landscape of disability ministry all across this country. So this morning I'll be preaching from Numbers, which if you know me, I'm very prone to do. Actually, not the biblical book. I'm sorry, that's not accurate. I mean actual numbers. As Steve said, I am a researcher at Baylor University, and my research really is focused on thinking about faith in the lives of people with disabilities and their families, and the movements of churches that embrace them or inadvertently exclude them, and the roads, the pathways to inclusion and belonging for both. And the portrait that I'll present through the data this morning, I think aligns so well with what the scriptures say matters most as we strive to follow Jesus together as one body, without asterisks, without exceptions. Now, you might be surprised to learn there are more than 350,000 churches all across the country. With my recent move to Baylor in Texas, I think half of them may actually be in Waco. I haven't counted, there's a few elsewhere. But each of those churches is planted in communities filled with people with disabilities. And in fact, each of those churches already includes members with disabilities, with chronic illness, with mental health challenges. In fact, there are more than 70 million Americans with disabilities residing in every community around the country in every state. That's 1 in 7 kids under 18. That's half of all seniors over 65. And if we started strolling out through the neighborhoods that surround each of our churches and started knocking on doors, what we would find is that 1 in every 3 households whose door we knocked on included at least one family member with disabilities. It could be these homes on the screen. But when we hear that biblical question of who is my neighbor, we have to make sure we never have answers that are too narrow. As people that are committed to loving our neighbors and reaching our communities, those kinds of numbers really ought to push us towards reflection. Who might still be missing from our midst? Is where and how we gather as a faith community somehow limiting who arrives or who actually returns? And how might we come alongside people to help them flourish in all areas of their lives? What will be our witness to a watching world? So the call on our churches is as clear. We're to invite the uninvited. We're to be lavish in our hospitality, to receive every gift, to love deeply beyond our usual circles. The way of Jesus is always one in which excluded people are seen as indispensable and integral, as needed and as loved. The call is clear, but what is the church's response? Well, I'd like to share some insights on the current portrait of landscape, and the current landscape of disability and ministry all across the country. And talk about our collective response as the church. This last year, we completed the first national study of disability and ministry in churches, and it involved interviewing 200 ministry leaders in 48 states in churches that were very intentional about widening their welcome in this way. And we learned a lot about the postures and the practices of churches that are marked by inclusion and belonging. I'm thankful to all of you who helped, many of you participated, many of you helped disseminate that, and I'm sorry to those 2 states that we didn't get to, but I've actually met people from those states already that we're going to get to you. So what can I share in 15 minutes from this snapshot of this large portrait of the movements of churches? Well, I want to highlight 4 really encouraging trends, and then suggest 4 areas where I think more movement might be needed. And I'll wrap up with some thoughts about how we might move forward faster and more faithfully as we work to change this landscape. So let's start with some of the encouraging trends that we're seeing. I would say that the church is stirring in this area. God has been calling us always to widen our welcome, and churches more and more are starting to respond. I'm convinced there's accelerating interest all around the country. And think about this figure that I'll put up on the screen. It really highlights the launch dates of churches that were part of our study, the launch dates of those formal ministries in all of those congregations, what you see is this accelerating increase, and more than half of all the ministries began in the last decade. There's a swelling interest here as well. The church is stirring, and we praise God for that. But the various catalysts within these different churches are really important to consider. In sharing a lot of their ministry's origin stories, the leaders that we interviewed often described initially this kind of reactive posture. In other words, their ministries were launched when someone in their church encountered disability, maybe at birth or through accident or through aging, or a family showed up for the first time, or the pastor's grandchild was diagnosed as being on the spectrum. And so they mobilized to make sure that church mobilized to make sure that the members and families were supported well, and a new ministry was born. But some leaders started to describe this very proactive posture. Someone in their church started to recognize unmet needs in their community, and they began to pursue children and families who weren't yet there. It was a parent who knew of so many other families who struggled to find a church that would welcome them back, or a special educator who knew of so many kids with disabilities who longed to belong, and a new outreach ministry was born. More and more churches are responding, and more churches are being proactive. Is yours? Well, second, we're seeing incredible innovation, and I've been struck by the breadth and the depth of what we're seeing in so many churches around the country. Whether that's programmatically or informally, we're seeing churches identifying ordinary and creative ways to support people with disabilities in worship and service and fellowship and learning and activities within and beyond the building, certainly, and also through Sunday and all throughout the week. For example, we found that 94% of those churches that are stepped into this space are incorporating one or more universal design elements into their worship services: communication supports, technology supports, sensory supports, and accessibility features. We found that 86% of these churches were coming alongside families in very active ways by offering respite care, hosting small groups or Bible studies for families, providing pastoral counseling or workshops, or just providing practical assistance throughout the week to those families. And 3/4 of those churches were actively working to promote greater awareness and acceptance through Disability Inclusion Sundays or preaching series or book studies. And almost half of churches have already started partnering with local community organizations and disability organizations to just extend invitations more deeply into their communities. For example, a small church in Pennsylvania budgets to send every one of their families to family camp every year. Another one in Alabama hosts marriage retreats for parents of kids with disabilities. A rural church in Wyoming sends a small delegation to the IEP meeting of every child with autism in their church. A large church in Tennessee hosts a free lending library of medical equipment for folks in their community. A church in Oklahoma just welcomed their first deacon with Down syndrome. A church in Delaware hosts annual appreciation events to honor direct support providers in their local community. A tiny church we talked with in Tennessee now has half of their members learning sign language in order to embrace one deaf member. And we talked to 6 different church plants around the country that began directly with the goal of making sure they were inclusive from the outset for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Praise God, our churches should be steeped in innovation and imagination, striving to widen their welcome. Is yours? Well, third, more churches are embracing inclusive models of ministry where children and adults with disabilities are expected and supported to participate in the same breadth of valued experiences as anyone else. And this reflects a very different change in posture, away from ministry apart from people with disabilities and right into ministry with people with disabilities. And the leaders we talked to talked about the importance of casting this broad vision in their church, of equipping leaders and volunteers, of fostering awareness, of personalizing supports, of embracing flexibility, and regularly reflecting on their postures and on their practices. Their journeys were complicated, sometimes even a little contentious, as change in church can often be. But their commitment to inclusion was grounded in these core theological understandings of the body, and as Lamar said, in the banquet as well. And the absence of asterisks from all of those one another's in scriptures made them wonder, why would we do it any other way? In fact, 82% of the churches in our study actively took steps to involve kids with disabilities in their ordinary Sunday school programs. They were intentional about the curriculum that they selected. They drew upon the support of peers and adults. They trained Sunday school leaders on inclusive practices, and they developed written support plans for individual kids. And some of those leaders started to talk about how these small sort of gestures of inclusion started to lead to greater inclusion. That as people with and without disabilities shared their faith and their friendship and their care and their companionship, the churches tended to pull away from practices that prevented those kinds of exchanges. Our churches should be the most inclusive places in our city. Is yours? And fourth, we learned that something extraordinary happens when we worship as one. When we learn and serve and fellowship together, that faithfulness brings real flourishing. More and more churches are discovering that our collective lives are enriched and enlivened when people with disabilities and their families are in the midst of all we do rather than at the margins. And all of those preconceived ideas we have about who benefits most when we choose to embrace accessibility start to shift from me versus you to really us and we. You see, in our interviews, we asked leaders about the impact of their ministry on people with disabilities and their families, and I doubt their answers would surprise probably any of you. They talked about spiritual growth and discipleship, about deeper involvement in the life of their church, about new friendships and belonging, about how people are now accessing much-needed care and practical supports and opportunities to serve and new encounters with love. That's the fruit I know so many of you see firsthand in your ministries. A wider welcome, it turns out, is good for people with disabilities. But about half of the individuals, the leaders that we interviewed, also shared, I think, a fuller story about the reciprocity that they discovered in the midst of this work. The leading theme in their conversations was really on how the whole church was more faithful and flourishing because people with and without disabilities were befriending and loving and serving and supporting and praying for and with one another. How all sorts of people started to experience spiritual growth and discipleship and deeper involvement and friendships and belonging when the church revisited how and where they gathered. And that also marked another important shift in posture from ministry with people with disabilities or to people with disabilities to ministry by people with disabilities. And our data sounded a lot like 1 Corinthians 12, right? You all know that. The way God designed our bodies is a model for understanding our lives together as a church. Every part dependent on every other part. The parts we mention, the parts we don't, the parts we see, the parts we don't. If one part hurts, every other part is involved in the hurt and in the healing. And if one part flourishes, every other part enters into the exuberance. It's a portrait of abundance. And when we worship as one, we flourish together. Is that true of your church as well? And do any of these four trends resemble what you see in your own congregation? Is there accelerating interest and innovations in practices, an embrace of inclusion and a mutual flourishing together? And if not, what might you do next to be marked by these kinds of movements? Well, there's much to celebrate, certainly, but there's also more movement that's needed. The current landscape of ministry and disability sort of reveals opportunities that I think are often being missed or only partially realized. Now, let me highlight four of those from our project as well. You see, the movement of churches is still incredibly uneven. This quickly becomes apparent if you ask the church stories of people with disabilities and their families. You'll hear stories of extravagant welcome. You'll hear stories of deep wounding, and it's really still hard to predict which of those themes you'll hear as the tears start to inevitably emerge. But it was also evident in the interviews we had with ministry leaders who often said they were the only church in their city or county that was actively pursuing their neighbors with disabilities. And while they were proud of their ministries, they didn't aspire to stand alone in their city. They wanted inclusive ministry to be an absolutely unremarkable thing in their communities. Yes, there's accelerating interest nationally, but it remains the exception rather than the rule. And we were readily able to recruit 200 churches that were actively doing this. I wonder if we could have found 2,000 or 20,000, right? Just a small fraction of those 350,000 churches. You might be surprised, there actually are some churches in this county as well, beyond Bay Presbyterian. There's 1,012 churches in this county. And how many would say they're invested in this work? And what proportion of those 350,000 churches need to still be stirred in some way? So there's an opportunity that lies certainly with smaller churches. We found that the average size church in our study was 1,000 members, but the median sized church is 75 members. So how can we strengthen the invitations to smaller churches? What's the guidance that they need? What are the models of ministry that make sense for their context? This is a looming sense we hear in smaller churches that we're not large enough or resourced enough or expert enough or fill in the blank enough. And there's a deference sometimes to larger congregations. So what role might our church play in spurring other congregations in our city to join us in this journey as well? And second, churches are still leaning pretty heavily on ministry models that are often separate and sometimes even segregated. This is particularly true in formal ministries focused on adults or individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For example, 77% of the churches in our study offered different Sunday school classes or Bible studies just for people with developmental disabilities. Half had separate social events, and 1 in 7 churches had separate vacation Bible schools for kids with disabilities. In many, not all of the cases, but in many of those cases, that was the only option available to certain children and adults. And so it wasn't congregation, it was separation, and it inadvertently limited who that person came to know in their church and who came to know them in that church. What experiences in the life of that church then did they miss out on, and who might never encounter the gifts and the friendship and the faith of those with disabilities. And sometimes churches were adopting practices they just saw modeled elsewhere in schools or employment or other settings. In some cases, ministry leaders begin with the assumption that the needs of those with developmental disabilities are so strikingly different than anyone else that specialized experiences may be needed. And certainly there are families that advocate for those kinds of experiences. But what we most heard from leaders was this: that the programs that were separate were born not out of, largely because the rest of the congregation was either reluctant or resistant to widening their practices. How might our churches reimagine our programs and activities so there really is a place for everyone in everything that we offer? And third, there's an enduring opportunity for ministries to reach beyond and between Sundays. In my work and my research, I found that the average week has 7 days. I've confirmed this. I've checked local calendars in Cleveland, all of them 7 days. And since we're at a church conference, I've checked Christian calendars, also 7 days. So you can count on that. But in many of the churches we studied, most planning and programs focused on a few hours on Sunday morning, supporting involvement in worship services and Sunday school classes. And no doubt this is incredibly important. But what if this was our starting point rather than our stopping point? What if the most powerful ministry opportunities take place between Sundays, after the benediction? People meet each other for the first time on Sundays, but friendships are formed in the midst and in between times. We learned about so many intriguing ways that churches are helping members with disabilities to flourish the other 6 days of the week. A church in Michigan helps connect young adults with developmental disabilities to community jobs that aligns with their gifts and sense of calling. A church in Indiana supports community living options by matching interested members to people with disabilities who need a companion to live with. A church in Colorado hosts unified sports leagues all throughout the year. A church in Wisconsin uses their accessible vans to provide transportation Monday through Friday. A church in Tennessee launched a day program embedded right in their church buildings. But only 10% of churches offer those kinds of broader focus. How can our churches promote the flourishing of people with disabilities and their families all 7 days of the week? And fourth, friendship should abound in our churches. We were created for community, and one of the most powerful gifts we can give to someone else is the gift of friendship. But friendships aren't always easy or automatic. They don't emerge simply because people attend the same church or because we've launched a formal ministry. And they can be especially elusive for some kids and adults with disabilities. So many of the leaders we interviewed talked about the challenges of really fostering those reciprocal relationships among the people they served and others in the life of that church. Finding volunteers was one thing. Fostering friendships was quite another. So the opportunity here is really to design ministries that create deep connections and belonging, that prioritize relationships. There's much more in this than sharing space on Sundays. This is about sharing lives all 7 days of the week. And it's less about the programs we offer and more about the people we introduce one another to. It looks like simply connecting people around shared interests and shared activities over time. Right? Churches that are intentional about inviting and supporting people with and without disabilities to serve together in the church, to join the same small groups, to share a meal, to watch the big game, to go to the park, to do a hobby together, to walk together, to pray together, to serve together, to worship together. How can our ministries encourage and support these kinds of everyday encounters? And what opportunities do you see for your church here in the midst of this? How can you spur other churches along? How can you adopt inclusive practices and think beyond Sundays and also foster more friendships? Well, I hope this brief glimpse into the current landscape of disability in ministry is useful. It's certainly a mix of promise and possibilities. And so I want to close with just a few reflections for those of you who are serving in organizations that come alongside churches in this work. I praise God for your faithfulness and your influence, because in so many of the interviews we did, the names of your organizations came up over and over as being instrumental in their launch and in their growth. Your work matters more than ever. And so we need to continue to strengthen supports for new ministry leaders. So many of the leaders that we interviewed were essentially making their way on their own. They brought great enthusiasm, but sometimes little training. They brought deep desire, but wanted and longed for direction. How could we work collectively together to make it easier for churches to find and access excellent resources and training and coaching and support throughout the year, not just at annual gatherings like this, but the other 363 days? And we also need more effective ways of engaging and equipping pastors. In almost every church we studied, disability ministry was born bottom up rather than top down. In other words, pastors were rarely the catalysts in their churches and often needed regular convincing. The exception was when it was pastors who had had children or grandchildren with disabilities. How might we start to go where pastors gather? How do we cast this call in new ways and places so that vision for inclusion permeates churches? But we also, I think, because of that, need to work collectively to transform ministry training. There are more than 200 seminaries across the United States, more than 200 Christian colleges and universities, but only a handful give serious attention to disability in ministry. So how can we elevate attention to disability in all of the places where our pastors and youth ministers and children's ministry leaders and worship leaders receive their formative training so that we're not filling in those gaps on the back end? And finally, we need more systematic ways of influencing churches on a broader scale. There's 355,000 congregations that need the gifts and the friendship and the faith of people with disabilities and their families. How can we partner in clever ways with denominations and ministry networks and associations and broader movements to amplify this call in ways that engage thousands of churches in this ministry? The call is certainly clear, and I'm so encouraged by the ways that all of you are responding faithfully and fervently in your own faith communities. And so I pray that we would really flourish together in our collective work as we strive to help our churches flourish together, churches without asterisks, without exceptions, churches where people without disabilities worship and serve and learn and fellowship together. So I do feel like I should actually go back to the book of Numbers in some way. And I'll do that by closing, by just extending this blessing to each of you, one that you're all familiar with. The Lord bless you and keep you. Lord, may his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. And the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. May God bless you in this work as you faithfully help your congregations and communities be places where everyone belongs, where everyone has a place, where every gift is received. Thank you.